Sometimes, a single sentence can travel farther than a private jet, cross an ocean of years, and reach a heart that money could never touch. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Grand Harbor restaurant on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Outside, yellow taxis crawled through the evening traffic, their headlights reflecting across the wet pavement like scattered gold. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast warm pools of light over white tablecloths, polished silverware, and conversations that floated through the room in low, practiced voices. Most people came here to be seen, to close deals, to celebrate victories, to remind the world who they were. Emily Carter came here for a different reason. She came because rent was due next week, because student loans did not care about dreams, because life had a way of rewriting plans without asking permission. At 26, she moved through the restaurant with quiet efficiency. Black uniform, hair tied neatly behind her head, a small notebook tucked into her apron. Nothing about her stood out. That was exactly how she preferred it. People rarely noticed the waitress. They noticed the celebrities, the investors, the executives wearing watches worth more than a year's salary. Emily had learned long ago that being overlooked could sometimes be an advantage. Near the back corner of the dining room sat a man nobody paid attention to. He wore a charcoal gray jacket without a visible designer logo. No entourage, no bodyguards, no expensive display of wealth. Just a simple leather briefcase resting beside his chair and a cup of black coffee slowly cooling near his hand. Several customers glanced at him throughout the evening. Most assumed he was an accountant, maybe a consultant, someone passing through the city for work. None of them knew his face. None of them recognized the man who quietly controlled companies on 3 continents. Ethan Nakamura preferred it that way. The less attention he received, the more honestly people behaved around him. He watched. He listened. And tonight, he was waiting for a phone call that had consumed nearly 20 years of his life. His fingers rested on an old silver keychain, attached to his briefcase. The metal had faded with age. Most people would have thrown it away years ago. Ethan never did. Some objects carried memories too valuable to replace. Across the room, Emily delivered a dessert menu to another table before glancing toward the corner. Something about the man caught her attention. Not because he looked wealthy. Quite the opposite. It was the way he sat. The way he observed everything without appearing to observe anything at all. And then she noticed the keychain. Her steps slowed. Just slightly. A tiny detail most people would have missed. An engraved symbol. Faded. Worn. Japanese. Her heartbeat skipped once. No, that couldn't be possible. She continued working, telling herself she was imagining things. Yet 10 minutes later, as she passed by again, she heard it. The man's phone vibrated. He answered immediately, and suddenly the quiet corner of the restaurant disappeared. At least for Emily, because the voice speaking through the phone wasn't English. It was Japanese. Fluent. Fast. Emotional. Ethan's expression changed instantly. The calm businessman vanished. In his place sat a son carrying an old wound. Emily kept walking. She wasn't trying to listen, but certain words reached her anyway. A village name. A family name. A date. Then another sentence. And another. Her grip tightened around the tray she carried. Her eyes widened. The sound of plates. The murmur of conversations. The gentle music overhead. Everything seemed distant now, because she recognized those names. She recognized that story. More importantly, she recognized why Ethan Nakamura looked as though he had spent 2 decades searching for something he could never find. When the call ended, Ethan remained motionless. His gaze settled on the rain beyond the glass. The disappointment on his face was subtle. Most people would never have noticed it. Emily did. She had seen that expression before. The expression of someone arriving 1 step too late. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Ethan reached into his briefcase and removed a folder thick with documents. He stared at it without turning a page. Around him, the restaurant continued as normal. Nobody noticed the billionaire. Nobody knew his story. Nobody understood the weight hidden behind his silence. Emily stood near the service station, holding a fresh cup of coffee. Her thoughts raced. Logic told her to walk away. Finish her shift. Mind her own business. That was the safe choice. But another voice refused to stay quiet. The voice that remembered stories told long ago. Stories she never expected to hear again. Finally, she picked up the coffee and crossed the dining room. Ethan barely looked up when she arrived. He seemed lost somewhere far away. Emily carefully placed the cup beside him. Then she spoke. Not in English. Not loudly. Just a single sentence in flawless Japanese. The man who saved your father during the earthquake is still alive. The folder slipped from Ethan Nakamura's hands. And for the first time in years, the billionaire was completely speechless. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The soft jazz playing through the restaurant speakers seemed to fade into the background. Rain continued tracing silver lines down the glass, while Ethan Nakamura stared at the young waitress standing beside his table. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for some sign that he had misunderstood what she had said. But Emily Carter remained calm. Her hands rested lightly against the coffee pot she carried. Her expression revealed nothing. Around them, customers continued eating expensive dinners, discussing stock prices, vacation homes, and business mergers, completely unaware that a single sentence had just shattered 20 years of unanswered questions. Ethan slowly rose from his chair. The movement was controlled, but the slight tremor in his hand betrayed something deeper. Hope. Dangerous hope. The kind that could rebuild a person or break them completely. How do you know that name? He asked quietly in Japanese. Emily glanced around the dining room before answering in the same language. Because I have heard that story since I was a child. Ethan blinked. The response only deepened the mystery. He looked at the silver keychain lying beside his folder. Then back at Emily. Who are you? The question hung between them. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. Not from fear. From caution. She had learned long ago that some stories should be opened carefully, like old letters sealed for decades. Just a waitress, she replied softly. Ethan almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was obviously untrue. Nothing about this moment felt ordinary anymore. Before he could ask another question, Emily noticed a manager approaching from across the room. She immediately shifted back into her professional role. Her posture straightened. Her voice returned to perfect customer service calm. Would you like a refill, sir? Ethan understood instantly. Whatever this conversation was, it could not happen here. Not yet. He nodded. Yes. Thank you. Emily poured the coffee, then walked away as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet Ethan could not take his eyes off her. For 20 years he had searched across Japan, California, Washington, and Hawaii. He had hired investigators, historians, researchers. He had followed hundreds of false leads. Every trail eventually disappeared. Every answer dissolved into silence. Then, on a rainy Tuesday night in Manhattan, a waitress had spoken 12 words and changed everything. Ethan sat down slowly. His pulse refused to settle. Across the dining room, Emily delivered appetizers to another table. She smiled politely when customers thanked her. She wrote orders into her notebook. She looked exactly like every other hardworking server in New York City. Yet somehow she carried a piece of information worth more to Ethan than any company he owned. He opened the old folder on the table. Inside were photographs worn from years of handling. Newspaper clippings. Maps. Letters. One photograph stopped him every time. A picture taken shortly after the earthquake that had changed his family forever. His father stood beside several local residents who had helped survivors reach safety. Most faces were blurry. One man stood near the edge of the frame. Tall. Smiling. Almost hidden from view. Ethan had spent half his life trying to identify him. His phone vibrated again. Another message from an investigator in Tokyo. Another apology. Another dead end. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before locking it. For the first time in years, the disappointment felt different. Smaller. Because somewhere inside this building sat a young woman who knew something no professional investigator had ever discovered. Emily felt his gaze from across the room. She did not look back immediately. Instead, she focused on carrying plates, clearing tables, and finishing orders. But her thoughts were no longer on work. They were on her grandfather, on stories told beside a fireplace years ago, on an old photograph stored inside a wooden box, and on the promise she had made never to interfere, a promise that had suddenly become much harder to keep. The dinner rush gradually filled every corner of the restaurant. Plates moved in steady rhythm. Glasses clinked softly. The smell of fresh bread and roasted herbs drifted through the air. Yet for Ethan Nakamura, the world had narrowed to a single question. Who was Emily Carter? He watched her from across the dining room as she moved between tables with effortless precision. Every customer received the same polite smile. Every order was delivered perfectly. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone carrying a secret connected to the most important search of his life. And that made her even more intriguing. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Ethan checked his watch. Normally, he would have left by now. His schedule rarely allowed extra time for anything unexpected. Tonight was different. Tonight, every instinct told him to stay. Near the service station, Emily organized receipts and prepared a tray of coffee cups. Her manager approached with a satisfied smile. "Good work tonight," he said. "Several customers specifically asked for you." Emily thanked him politely. Compliments never meant much. They helped pay nothing. They changed nothing. She returned to work, but her thoughts remained fixed on the man sitting alone near the window. She remembered being 10 years old, sitting on her grandfather's porch in Vermont while autumn leaves drifted across the yard. He would tell stories as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Most children heard fairy tales. Emily heard stories about real people, real places, real acts of kindness. One story had always stood apart from the others. A story about a young Japanese father caught in a devastating earthquake decades ago. A stranger had helped him when nobody else could. Her grandfather never described himself as a hero. In fact, he disliked the word. "I only did what any decent person should do," he would always say. Then he would change the subject. As Emily grew older, she learned something unusual. Her grandfather never revealed the man's name. Never. Not once. Yet tonight she had heard that name spoken clearly through Ethan's phone conversation. Nakamura. The moment she heard it, memories had returned like pieces of a puzzle suddenly fitting together. Across the room, Ethan opened the old folder again. This time he studied every page carefully. One photograph caught his attention more than the others. The image was faded, creased, nearly 30 years old. He lifted it closer to the light. A group of people stood together after the disaster. Most faces were impossible to identify. Yet something felt different now. For years he had looked at the photograph, searching for answers. Tonight, he wondered if the answer had been waiting all along. His attention shifted toward Emily again. A possibility entered his mind. Unlikely, almost impossible. Yet he could not ignore it. What if her connection to the story was not accidental? What if she knew more than a single detail? What if she knew everything? The thought accelerated his heartbeat. At that moment, an elderly customer accidentally dropped a fork near Ethan's table. Emily immediately crossed the room and picked it up before the man could bend down. Her kindness was simple, natural, unforced. Ethan noticed the gratitude in the customer's eyes. He noticed how Emily smiled before quietly returning to work. The scene lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet something about it reminded him of the stories his father used to tell. Stories about ordinary people performing extraordinary acts without expecting recognition. Suddenly, Ethan understood why his father had spent years searching for the stranger who helped him. It was never about repaying a debt. It was about gratitude, about honoring a moment that changed everything. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. The city lights reflected across damp sidewalks like scattered stars. Inside, Emily glanced toward the window and saw Ethan standing. He collected his folder, closed his briefcase. Then instead of leaving, he walked slowly toward her. Customers continued talking. Servers continued working. Nobody paid attention. Yet Emily felt her pulse quicken. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached into the folder and carefully removed the old photograph. "I think," he said quietly, "you recognized something the moment you saw me." He placed the photograph on the counter between them. Emily looked down. The instant her eyes found the image, her breath caught. Because standing near the edge of the photograph was a face she knew better than her own. Emily stared at the photograph as though time itself had stopped moving. The sounds of the restaurant faded again. The conversations, the laughter, the gentle clinking of glasses. Everything seemed distant. Because the smiling man standing near the edge of that old photograph was unmistakable, even though he was nearly 30 years younger. Even though his hair had once been darker. Even though the image was faded by time. She recognized him immediately. It was her grandfather, William Carter. Ethan noticed the change in her expression. The way her eyes widened. The way her breathing slowed. He did not need an answer anymore. The photograph had already given him one. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Emily carefully looked up. "Where did you get this?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced down at the photograph. "My father kept it." His voice carried a quiet reverence. "After the earthquake," He spent years trying to identify everyone who helped him. Most names were eventually found. One was not. He gently touched the corner of the image. This man disappeared before anyone could properly thank him. Emily lowered her gaze again. Her grandfather had never mentioned a billionaire, never mentioned international companies, never mentioned that anyone was searching for him. He had told the story as if it were an ordinary memory, one small moment in a long life. Nothing more. Ethan studied her face carefully. You know him? It was not a question. Emily nodded once. Yes. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not anxiety. Relief. The kind that arrives after carrying a burden for so long that it becomes part of who you are. Is he alive? Emily hesitated. Not because she wanted to hide the truth. Because she suddenly understood how much this answer mattered. Yes, she said. He is 83 years old. He lives in Vermont. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The restaurant disappeared completely. For 20 years, he had imagined hundreds of possible endings to this search. Most ended with disappointment. Some ended with dead ends. None looked like this. None involved a waitress in Manhattan casually revealing that the answer had been quietly living in New England all along. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with emotion he rarely allowed others to see. My father passed away 5 years ago, he said quietly. But until the end, he spoke about that man. Emily listened without interrupting. He always said there are moments that divide a life into before and after. Ethan smiled faintly. For him, meeting your grandfather was one of those moments. Emily felt her throat tighten. She remembered William Carter sitting on a wooden porch swing, drinking coffee at sunrise, feeding birds in the backyard, fixing old furniture for neighbors who could not afford replacements. He never acted like someone important. Yet somehow, without realizing it, he had become unforgettable to a family on the other side of the world. A server approached and quietly informed Emily that another table needed assistance. She apologized and promised to return in a moment. Ethan nodded. As she walked away, he remained standing beside the counter. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about acquisitions, shareholders, or quarterly reports. He was thinking about gratitude. 20 minutes later, the dining room began to thin. Customers paid their bills and disappeared into the damp Manhattan night. The rain had finally stopped. Reflections shimmered across the sidewalks outside. Emily finished her last table and returned to the counter. Ethan was still there, waiting patiently, not like a billionaire accustomed to immediate answers, like a son trying to honor a promise. Emily reached into her apron pocket and removed her phone. She hesitated for only a second before opening a photo album. Then she turned the screen toward him. Ethan looked down. The image showed an elderly man sitting on a porch wrapped in a flannel blanket. A golden retriever slept beside his chair. Autumn leaves covered the yard behind him. The man was smiling. Calm. Content. Ethan stared at the photograph. Then he looked back at the old image from the earthquake. The same eyes. The same smile. The same quiet kindness. After 20 years of searching, the stranger was no longer a mystery. He finally had a name. William Carter. Ethan continued staring at the photograph on Emily's phone long after she lowered it. The image seemed impossibly ordinary. An elderly man on a porch. A dog sleeping nearby. Fallen leaves scattered across the lawn. Yet to Ethan, it felt more valuable than any asset listed in his company's annual report. For years he had imagined the stranger as larger than life. A legendary figure hidden somewhere beyond reach. Instead, he was a grandfather living quietly in Vermont. The realization filled him with unexpected emotion. Emily slipped her phone back into her apron pocket. Neither spoke for several seconds. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than conversation. Finally, Ethan smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that appeared rarely and never for cameras. My father would not believe this, he said softly. Emily nodded. My grandfather probably would not believe it either. That answer made Ethan laugh quietly. The sound surprised even him. Across the room, employees began preparing for closing. Chairs were being stacked. Receipts organized. Lights dimmed slightly. The city outside had settled into the calm rhythm that arrived after midnight. Ethan looked around the nearly empty restaurant. How long have you known? Emily considered the question carefully. Not long. She glanced toward the rain-streaked windows. I recognized the village name during your phone call. Then I saw the keychain. Ethan looked down at the old silver keychain resting beside his folder. You recognize this? Emily nodded. My grandfather has one exactly like it. Ethan froze. A strange feeling passed through him. Not shock. Confirmation. Another piece of a puzzle finally finding its place. The same symbol, he asked. The same symbol, Emily replied. Ethan carefully picked up the keychain. His father had carried it for decades. It had survived international flights, business meetings, family celebrations, and countless moves. He remembered seeing it hanging near the front door of their home when he was a child. He remembered asking about it. His father always answered the same way. It reminds me that kindness can change a life. At the time, Ethan never fully understood those words. Now he did. Emily checked the clock on the wall. Her shift officially ended in 15 minutes. Yet neither seemed eager to leave. The conversation had become something bigger than either expected. Ethan carefully returned the photograph to its protective sleeve. There is something I should tell you. Emily listened. For 20 years, investigators searched across 3 countries. He shook his head with disbelief. We reviewed records, interviewed people, even hired historians. His eyes drifted toward the photograph again, and somehow the answer was serving coffee in Manhattan. Emily smiled faintly. Life likes surprises. Apparently. Another moment of comfortable silence settled between them. Then Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. Does your grandfather know my family has been searching for him? Emily immediately shook her head. No, never. Never. Ethan leaned back slightly. That answer revealed more about William Carter than any biography ever could. Most people would have told the story repeatedly. Most would have welcomed recognition. Yet this man had quietly returned home and continued living his life. No interviews. No attention. No expectations. Just kindness followed by silence. The realization deepened Ethan's respect even further. Near the entrance, a cleaning crew began arriving. One employee switched off a row of decorative lights. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller and more intimate. Emily removed her order book and placed it inside her bag. Her shift was officially over. Ethan noticed the worn edges of the notebook. The practical shoes she had worn all evening. The tiredness she carried beneath her calm expression. She did not look like someone connected to an international mystery. She looked like someone working hard to build a future. Yet tonight she had changed his life without even trying. As they prepared to leave, Ethan's phone vibrated again. Another message from Tokyo. He opened it automatically, then stopped reading halfway through. The investigator was reporting another failed lead. Another location checked. Another dead end. Ethan stared at the message for a second before quietly deleting it. For the first time in 20 years, the search was over. The answer had already been found. Outside, Manhattan glistened beneath fresh rain. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement in long ribbons of gold and silver. Emily stepped out of the restaurant, carrying her coat over one arm. The cool night air felt refreshing after hours inside the crowded dining room. Behind her, Ethan emerged a few moments later with his briefcase and folder. For a second, they simply stood beneath the awning, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Car horns echoed several blocks away. A subway rumbled somewhere beneath the streets. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet both knew this night had changed something important. Ethan looked toward the clouds drifting above the skyline. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I would like to travel to Vermont. Emily turned toward him. The request did not surprise her. In truth, she had expected it. You want to meet him? Ethan nodded. More than anything. His answer carried no hesitation, no calculation, no business strategy, just sincerity. Emily studied his face. For the first time all evening, she was not looking at a billionaire. She was looking at a son trying to fulfill a promise left behind by his father. I think he would like that, she said softly. Ethan released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Then a thought crossed his mind. Would you come with me? Emily blinked. The question caught her off guard. Why me? Ethan smiled faintly. Because none of this happens without you. The city lights reflected in the glass behind them. Emily considered the invitation carefully. She had plans, responsibilities, bills waiting at home, a shift scheduled the next day. Yet something inside her already knew the answer. Some opportunities arrived only once. I can ask for a day off, she finally said. Ethan nodded with obvious relief. For a moment neither spoke. Then his attention drifted toward the worn notebook sticking out of her bag. Can I ask you something? Emily smiled. You have been asking questions all night. Fair point. Ethan laughed softly. Why are you working here? The question was simple. Yet Emily knew what he meant. He was not asking about the restaurant. He was asking about her life. About the gap between who she appeared to be and what she clearly knew. Emily looked down the street before answering. After college, my mother got sick. Her voice remained calm. Medical bills piled up. I left school before finishing my graduate program. Ethan listened carefully. Linguistics. International languages. Ethan nodded. Suddenly many things made sense. Her flawless Japanese. Her attention to detail. The ease with which she noticed things others overlooked. Emily shrugged lightly. Life changed directions. Do you regret it? She thought for a moment, then shook her head. Some days are harder than others. But regret is heavy. I try not to carry things that make the journey harder. Ethan fell silent. The answer stayed with him. He had spent years surrounded by people obsessed with achievement, status, and wealth. Yet this waitress standing beneath a Manhattan awning seemed to possess a wisdom many executives never found. A black car slowly pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Ethan glanced at the vehicle before looking back at Emily. I spent years searching for your grandfather, he said. And tonight I learned something unexpected. Emily raised an eyebrow. What is that? Ethan smiled. Sometimes the person you are looking for is not the only person worth finding. Emily looked away, slightly embarrassed by the compliment. The driver politely waited beside the car. The city breeze lifted a few strands of hair across her face. Ethan checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. Tomorrow would arrive quickly. I will arrange everything, he said. Flight, transportation, whatever we need. Emily laughed. You sound like a billionaire again. Ethan paused, then laughed as well. Maybe a little. For the first time that evening, the weight he had carried for 2 decades felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. Because tomorrow, after 20 long years, the search would finally become a meeting. The next morning arrived beneath a clear Vermont sky. Gone were the towering buildings and endless noise of Manhattan. In their place stood rolling hills, winding country roads, and fields painted gold by early autumn sunlight. Emily sat beside the window of the SUV as they traveled north through a landscape she had known her entire life. Small white churches appeared between clusters of maple trees. Red barns stood quietly against distant hillsides. Everything felt slower here. Simpler. Ethan sat across from her, holding the old photograph in his hands. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined the moment ahead. 20 years of searching, 20 years of questions. And now only a few miles separated him from the answer. Neither spoke much during the drive. Some journeys carried their own gravity. Words only got in the way. Finally, the vehicle turned onto a narrow country road lined with stone fences and tall oak trees. Emily looked out the window and smiled softly. We are close. Ethan followed her gaze. At the end of the road stood a modest white farmhouse surrounded by open land. A wooden porch stretched across the front. Wind chimes moved gently in the morning breeze. Nearby, a golden retriever rested beneath a maple tree whose leaves had begun turning shades of orange and red. Everything about the place felt peaceful, timeless. The SUV came to a stop. For a moment, nobody moved. Ethan stared through the window. The farmhouse looked nothing like the corporate towers he owned. Yet his heartbeat accelerated more than it ever had before entering a boardroom. Emily opened the door first. The cool air carried the scent of fresh grass and distant wood smoke. She stepped onto the gravel driveway and looked toward the porch. There, sitting in a weathered wooden chair with a blanket across his lap, was William Carter. He was reading a book. A pair of glasses rested low on his nose. His silver hair caught the sunlight. The golden retriever lifted its head first. Then William looked up. The moment he saw Emily, his face brightened immediately. There is my favorite granddaughter, he called warmly. Emily laughed and walked toward him. William stood carefully and wrapped her in a gentle hug. Ethan remained near the vehicle, watching quietly. Something about the scene affected him more deeply than expected. It felt real in a way photographs never could. This was not a legend, not a mystery, not a story passed through generations. This was simply a grandfather greeting his granddaughter on a beautiful autumn morning. William finally noticed the unfamiliar visitor standing near the driveway. His eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. And who do we have here? Emily glanced toward Ethan. Suddenly, she felt nervous. Not because anything was wrong, because she understood how important this moment was. Ethan slowly approached the porch. The old photograph remained tucked inside his jacket. For a second, neither man spoke. One carried decades of unanswered gratitude. The other had no idea why a stranger had traveled across the country to see him. William offered a friendly smile. "You came a long way to visit Vermont." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." His voice was calm, but carried unmistakable emotion beneath the surface. William gestured toward an empty chair. "Then you should sit down. Nobody should travel that far without being offered coffee." Emily smiled. That sounded exactly like her grandfather. Ethan sat. The porch creaked softly beneath the chair. Wind rustled through the maple leaves overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. William studied Ethan for a moment. Then he looked at Emily. "Something tells me this is not an ordinary visit." Emily exchanged a glance with Ethan. Neither needed to say it aloud. The moment they had traveled so far to reach was finally here. William looked from Emily to Ethan and back again. The smile on his face remained, but curiosity had clearly taken its place. He closed the book resting on his lap and set it carefully on the small table beside him. The golden retriever stretched lazily and settled back down near the porch steps. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, carrying a shower of red and gold leaves across the yard. Ethan reached into his jacket and removed the old photograph. For a moment, he simply held it. The edges were worn from decades of handling. Countless flights, countless meetings, countless moments spent searching for answers. Finally, he handed it to William. The older man adjusted his glasses and looked down. His expression changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for Emily to notice. Recognition. William studied the image for several seconds before letting out a quiet breath. "Well," he said softly, "I have not seen this picture in a very long time." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "You remember it?" William nodded. "Of course." His finger gently touched one corner of the photograph. "Someone took this a few days after the earthquake." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "My father was there." William looked up. For a second, silence settled over the porch. Then something clicked behind the older man's eyes. A memory. A face. A name carried across decades. "Nakamura," he said quietly. Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes." William sat back slowly. "I remember him." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of 20 years. Ethan stared at him, unable to speak. William smiled faintly as he looked toward the distant hills. He was worried about his family. His voice had softened into the tone people use when revisiting old memories. More worried about them than himself. Ethan listened carefully. Every word mattered. He talked about his wife. About his young son. William glanced toward Ethan. "That son was you." Ethan nodded. His eyes never left the older man's face. William laughed quietly. "Life is something, is it not?" Emily watched both men. One carried memories. The other carried gratitude. Somehow those two things had finally arrived at the same place. Ethan took a slow breath. "My father never forgot you." William looked genuinely surprised. "Really? Never?" Ethan's answer came immediately. "He spent years trying to find you." The older man shook his head. "There was no reason for that." "There was every reason." Ethan's voice grew stronger. "You changed his life." William looked away toward the fields beyond the house. For several moments he said nothing. Then he smiled. "Funny thing about kindness." Ethan waited. "Most of the time," William continued, "the person giving it forgets. The person receiving it remembers forever." The words settled over the porch like autumn sunlight. Emily felt them too, because they sounded exactly like something her grandfather would say. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. He thought about his father keeping the silver keychain for decades. About the stories repeated throughout his childhood. About investigators crossing oceans searching for a man who never expected recognition. Suddenly, he understood something important. William Carter had never viewed himself as the hero of the story. He had simply been a decent person on an ordinary day. "There is something else," Ethan said quietly. William looked at him. "What is that?" Ethan reached into his briefcase and removed a small wooden box. He placed it carefully on the table between them. "My father asked me to do something if I ever found you." William stared at the box. Emily stared too. Ethan opened the lid. Inside rested the old silver keychain. Sunlight caught the faded metal. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ethan gently pushed the box toward him. He wanted it returned to the man who taught him what gratitude looks like. William's eyes remained fixed on the keychain. The breeze moved softly through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called across the valley. And for the first time since arriving in Vermont, The older man's smile disappeared, replaced by something deeper. Something that looked very much like a heart remembering a moment it thought time had erased. William continued staring at the silver keychain resting inside the wooden box. His weathered hands remained still on the armrests of his chair. The autumn breeze moved gently through the porch, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant pine trees. For several moments, nobody spoke. Ethan understood why. Some memories arrive quietly, not with noise or drama, but with the weight of years returning all at once. Finally, William reached forward and carefully lifted the keychain. The metal glimmered softly in the afternoon sun. He turned it over in his hands, studying every scratch and worn edge. Then a small smile appeared. "I remember this." Ethan leaned forward. "You do?" William nodded. "Your father dropped it while helping clear debris after the earthquake." He chuckled softly. He was convinced he had lost it forever. Ethan felt his chest tighten. That detail had never appeared in any report. No investigator had ever uncovered it. It was the kind of memory only someone who had truly been there could know. William continued looking at the keychain. "I found it later and handed it back to him." He shook his head slowly. "I never imagined he kept it all these years." Ethan smiled. "He never traveled without it." The older man lowered his eyes. For the first time, emotion became visible on his face. Not sadness, gratitude. The quiet kind that comes from learning a small act mattered more than you ever realized. Emily watched both men and felt a warmth spread through her chest. She suddenly understood why her grandfather never talked about recognition. The reward had never been recognition. It had always been knowing someone else made it home safely. Ethan reached into his briefcase one final time. This time he removed a sealed envelope. "There is something else my father wanted." William raised an eyebrow. Ethan handed him the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Years old, carefully preserved. William unfolded it slowly. His eyes moved across the page. As he read, the porch fell completely silent. Emily could see his expression changing line by line. At one point he smiled. At another, he blinked several times behind his glasses. When he finally reached the end, he folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. "What did he say?" Emily asked softly. William looked toward the fields stretching beyond the house. "He thanked me." Ethan smiled. "He waited a long time to do that." William nodded. "Yes." Then he looked directly at Ethan. "And now you have done it for him." The words settled deeply between them. For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt the search truly end. Not because answers had been found, because gratitude had finally arrived where it belonged. Hours passed more quickly than anyone expected. They shared coffee on the porch. They exchanged stories. William told memories from decades ago. Ethan shared stories about his father and the life he built afterward. The afternoon sun slowly drifted lower across the sky. Eventually, it was time to leave. Ethan stood near the driveway while the golden retriever wandered lazily through the grass. William shook his hand firmly. "I am glad you came." Ethan nodded. "I am glad I never stopped searching." Then William smiled and pointed toward Emily. "You should thank her." Ethan laughed. "Believe me, I know." Emily rolled her eyes playfully, but she smiled. As the SUV pulled away from the farmhouse, Ethan looked back through the window. William remained on the porch, one hand raised in farewell. The silver keychain rested in his pocket once again. Beside Ethan, Emily watched the farmhouse disappear behind rows of autumn trees. Neither spoke for several miles. Words felt unnecessary. Some stories do not end with applause. They end with understanding. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "when I walked into that restaurant, nobody recognized me." Emily smiled. "That probably happens more often than you think." Ethan looked out the window. "Maybe." Then he glanced toward her. But the person nobody noticed turned out to be the one who changed everything. Emily laughed quietly and looked back at the passing countryside. The late afternoon sun painted the hills gold. Somewhere behind them, an old promise had finally been fulfilled. And somewhere ahead, new chapters waited to be written. Because in the end, the rarest language in the world was never Japanese. It was gratitude remembered across a lifetime.